Grant Bartley from Philosophy Now magazine, and you're listening to the Philosophy Now radio show. Welcome back to the new series and Happy New Year. Today we'll be talking about moral psychology. I have with me Constantine Sandis from Oxford Brookes University, Alex Gregory from Reading University, and Michael Lacewing from Heythrop College, University of London. Sian, Hender and Adam Leach will be providing live music. So let's just dive straight into it. What is moral psychology?
So moral psychology
Moral
psychology addresses issues at the intersection of the study of morals and the study of mind. So a sort of central question is how people can be motivated to be moral, but this spills over into general questions about decision-making, motivation and responsibility.
Okay, great. Anybody want to add anything to that?
That sounds right to me.
That's Constantine.
I would agree with that. In the questions of motivation, for instance, and decision making, then some of the examples of the things that philosophers and psychologists who are interested in moral psychology would talk about would be reason and emotion and the relation between those. The two big ideas, I suppose, in the history of ethics is that morality is really something which we are is a result of our rationality, famously associated with somebody like Kant.
Okay.
But then, of course, another idea, famous from many of the world religions, is that morality is really to do with love or sympathy or something like that, benevolence towards other people. So moral psychologists are interested in the psychological aspects of those questions, the role that emotions and reasoning plays.
Okay, how does moral psychology differ from like traditional morality in philosophy or ethics, they might call it? Constantine, do you want to have a go on
I think one question is whether moral psychology is a kind of distinct branch of ethics. So normally people divide ethics into what they call normative or theoretical ethics, which is really theories about how one ought to behave.
Right.
So consequentialism would be an obvious such theory.
Based on the consequences of your actions is what is good, yeah?
That's right. So it would tell you should do whatever maximizes the good, and then you'd plug in a theory of what goodness is.
Right.
And then there's practical ethics, where some people think you apply these theories to particular situations to get an answer about what you should do. And then some might think, well, moral psychology is yet a third branch of moral philosophy that does neither of these two things.
What does it do differently?
You might think it asks questions about, like we said, the mind and motivation and so on. But then again, you might think, no, it's not really a third branch. You kind of need it to answer the other two.
Sure, what I'm getting at, though, is surely the other branches of the other type approaches to ethics, they ask questions about motivation. Why does moral psychology differ from that?
Insofar as they ask questions about motivation, it seems to me that they're doing moral psychology.
Really?
So the division between these subjects is quite blurry at times.
Right.
But I'm not sure that's a problem. That seems perfectly fine.
Okay.
I would agree.
Michael?
I would agree with that. I mean, the three main ideas that in normative ethics, that branch of studying morality to provide a theory about what we should do. The three big ideas are whether an action is right or wrong depends on the motive that you have for doing it. Whether an action is right or wrong depends on the consequences of the action.
Right.
Or a third one is whether it fits into what a virtuous person, a person with a virtuous character.
Okay.
Now, all three of those have certain commitments to, well, what would motivate us?
Or
they often
different
do.
motivations.
Yes, so for
theory,
instance, if you thought that what you ought to do is to make the most number of people happy, you would expect that theory to go with a moral psychology which said we are motivated by our concern for people's happiness. Could be an obvious part. So normative theories have moral psychological implications.
Yeah, or assumptions.
So moral psychology is isolating that part. It's not an attempt to say what is right or wrong, but why do people do what they do?
To get the right moral theory, it's trying to get the right moral motive, or suss out people's moral motivations. Is that right?
But that could affect which theory is the right one.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, what sort of things can moral psychology tell us which traditional ethical philosophy can't?
Well, one way in which you might think ethical theories are constrained is by what's sort of psychologically realistic for us. So if you had some theory that told you ought to make great sacrifices all the time for the expense of other people, and human beings, let's imagine, just aren't capable of that, you might think that was a mark against the theory, at least to some extent, that what it asked us to do we're just not capable of doing. That might be a problem for the theory.
That's right. So some philosophers think that ought implies can, which means something like, if you should do something, you must be able to do it. And maybe moral psychology can tell us things about
the limits.
The limits, so especially psychological ability, for example, to overcome certain kinds of obstacles.
So what sort of limits would it place upon our moral obligations then? I mean, according to the sort of the present level of the theory, if you want to put it like that.
Well, it depends a lot on who you ask and what sort of views they've got in moral psychology.
Well, I'm interested in your personal view, so what would you say, for instance, Alex?
Oh, that's a difficult question.
Can I try?
Sure, this is Constantine.
One question, one issue might be whether you think you can act against your own desires, whether your desires might be a bad thing that you overcome, or whether you think we always do what we most desire, for example. So you might think that duty and desire are kind of opposites, or you might think they have to come together in some way.
That's right.
Another idea that goes back to the ancient Greeks is the notion of achieving some kind of psychological harmony. So Plato and Aristotle put a lot of emphasis on the thought that, if you like, we have different motivational systems or different ways that the mind relates to our thoughts about the world and what we want and what to do, and that one of the most important things that we can do is to bring these into harmony. Now that receives a particular twist and development in ideas, for instance, from psychoanalysis. So Freud also emphasized the idea that there is these different parts of the mind. They have different functions, and they can come into conflict with each other. And then you can ask a very important question: is the objective of psychological harmony something which is worth striving for? Is it something which human beings are capable of? Freud himself was quite pessimistic about this, but other psychoanalysts have been quite optimistic about this. So that's a sort of theory of human nature which might give you a sense as to whether, for instance, being moral at all is something which human beings could really feel comfortable with, or whether we'll always feel there's a struggle to be morally good.
I mean, doesn't traditionally morality always involve some sort of idea of sacrifice, for instance? Would that be contrary to moral psychological theory?
I guess there's debates between people who think that there can be such a thing as altruism, so that sacrifice is possible, and those who think it's possible tend to think it's also a desirable thing, and those who seem to think that, strictly speaking, all acts are in self-interest or something like that, so that there's no such sacrifice is impossible, therefore we can't demand it of people.
All right. Just getting a bit more particular now, what sort of questions are you personally, as philosophy department lecturers and researchers, interested in moral psychology? Alex, what questions interest you about this area?
So I'm most interested in the role of desires in explaining our actions and in justifying them. So there's one thought that we always ought to act in ways that satisfy our desires. This is a relatively sort of popular view. And one motivation for holding that view is to say, well, look, we're only ever motivated to act by our desires. So it would be sort of, as Constantine was saying, sort of ought implies can principle. It could never be true that we ought to do something we didn't want to do, because we're just not capable of doing that. So the question is it really true that we're only capable of being motivated to act by our desires? That's a view I've got a lot of interest in.
Do you have a conclusion on that, or are you still like...
So I have quite a strange view. So I think it's true that we're only ever motivated to act by our desires. But I think the significance of that view depends a lot on what you take a desire to be. So I take desires to be roughly sensitivities to what's of value in the world. So on that view, we're only motivated to act by our desires, but there's still a pretty good place in motivation for moral considerations to play a role.
All right. Okay, Constantine, what's your bee in your bonnet?
I also came into moral psychology from what we might call action explanation or accounts of how to explain action. But I was initially more interested in the role of reasons and comparing maybe moral reasons to reasons why we act, what's sometimes called motivating reasons.
Okay.
And there's various debates in philosophy about what kind of things are they? Are they the same things? If you read a lot of cognitive psychology or philosophy of mind, they might say these are mental states or neurological states even. Whereas if you read normative ethics, or like we were talking about before, in practical ethics, they'll say that reasons are facts or states of the world or something like that.
I think we're going to be talking about a bit of the possible conflict between desire and reason in the second part of the programme. But okay, Michael, what about you? What particularly interests you in this field?
I came into this through thinking about emotions and the role that emotions play, not so much in moral action, but in our moral judgments. Okay. So, why do we think certain things are right or wrong, and how do we justify those judgments? So, my research then took me into the sort of complexity of emotional life that human beings have, and that took me into the area of psychoanalysis and looking at that. So, for instance, like Alex, a lot of philosophers, myself included, think desires and emotions are responses to things that we find to be valuable in the world. So if I'm angry, I get angry because I think that what's just happened is in some way, for instance, offensive or injurious to me. And if I'm sad, that's because I think something of value has been lost. So those would be examples of that kind of thing. Now, our emotions go all over the place. They don't always align with what we actually think is right. Morally right, or of what's of real value. I can really want that piece of cake, but it's after Christmas, I'm trying to lose weight. So there's a conflict between what I think. So in that case, if our emotions are how we discover what's of value, what do we do when our emotions conflict?
Okay, that's a good question. I think we're going to start with that question once we come back from the music. And to give us the live music here, we have Sian Hender on the cello and Adam Paul Leach on the guitar and singing. And their first song will be called Long Black Train.
That's right. Thank you, Grant. There's a long black train rolling down the line. There's a long black train rolling down the line. I can feel the wheels thunder. I can hear that whistle cry. Mr. Engine Driver, oh, please pass me by. Mr. Engine Driver, won't you please pass me by? I know we made a deal, but now I've changed my mind. You can have your diamonds, and you can have your pearls. You can have your diamonds, or you can have your pearls. They don't mean nothing to me since you stole my girl. Oh, come on now. Papa always told me, son, nothing in life is free. Oh, Papa always told me, son, nothing in life is free. Well, the coming after me. There's a long black train rolling down the line. There's a long black train rolling down the line. I can feel the wheels thunder. I can hear that whistle cry. Oh, come on now. Change my mind.
Thank you, Ed and Sean. That was a long black train, and we'll have another song or two from them later. Okay, I'm Grant Bartley. You're listening to the Philosophy Now radio show. I have with me Alex Gregory from Reading University, Constantine Sandis from Oxford Brookes, and Michael Lacewing from Heythrop College, the University of London. We're talking about moral psychology, and I just want to dive in with this sort of central question of traditional philosophy of morality, if you like, which is reason more important for influencing our moral behaviour, or whether we decide to behave morally or not, or as somebody like Kant might say, or is our emotional motivation more important, as somebody like Hume would have said? Who wants to start with that one?
Well, I suppose I'll start. I mean,
Alex.
I wonder whether this is really a competition, as though one of these is going to win. You might say, look, sometimes we're motivated by our emotions, and sometimes we're motivated by reason. And there's no sort of competition here. It's just different circumstances, different things motivate us.
Okay, so in which case, where does the balance lie between them?
Well, there's also,
Constantine,
going back to balance, a kind of hidden assumption in the way you phrased your question, right, which is maybe that emotions can't be rational, or that somehow what is an emotion is different from what is reason.
Okay. Traditionally, though, philosophers in this area have, as going back to, I think, Socrates, would say that they're two different. That you can have a conflict between them, and the question is when your reason tells you to do something, and your emotions or your passions tell you to do another thing, then which of them is going to win out?
Well, I think that you're right, that contrast goes back to Socrates, and one of the exciting things of the last sort of 30 years
in moral psychology,
in psychology and in philosophy,
right,
has to completely rethink that contrast.
Right.
There was a very famous book in the mid-1990s by a neuroscientist called Antonio Damasio called Descartes' Error, in which, using neuroscientific evidence, he argued that our moral reasoning, and the part of our brain involved in moral reasoning, drew very heavily on those parts of our brain which were involved in our emotional responses.
Yeah.
And he did this partly by showing that people who had damage to their emotional responses weren't, in fact, capable of doing moral reasoning in the normal sense, right, in which we accept that. Now, I mean, there's a lot of empirical evidence, both from neuroscience and elsewhere, that that we have two sets of responses, but whether they fall into the rational and the emotional doesn't seem quite right at all. Right. And sometimes psychologists make the same problematic assumption that if they are talking about the emotions, they've got to be talking about a non-rational system. But I just don't think that follows anymore.
It seems to be more the case that our emotions which way round is it? That our emotions sort of guide our reasons, or do our reasons guide the formations of our emotions? I mean, you have two. You're both interested in these areas. What would you say about
I think that's a very good question, Grant. And one question is the one about guidance, as you put it, and another is whether we could be motivated at all if we lacked one of these two things. So you might think if ideally we should only be guided by our reason, then we could know everything we need to know about morality and act on it without having any emotions, any sentiments at all.
Like Mr. Spock.
And that's like Mr. Spock. And that's one kind of popular view. On the other hand, there are those who think that somehow if there was no such thing as caring or love or emotion or sentiment, we either couldn't be motivated to act, or perhaps even worse, we wouldn't even be able to have the right moral judgments.
Okay. Well, Alex, on your scheme, how do the desires and reasons relate together? I mean, what happens if they conflict? Do they conflict ever?
So I'm somewhat inclined to think that desires just are sort of beliefs about what we have reason to do, what we've got at least some justification for doing.
Could you give me an example, for instance?
So, I don't know, I want to pursue a career in philosophy,
right.
And part of that is I think I've got some good reason to do that. I think there's something worthwhile about that pursuit. Perhaps it's isn't a moral choice, but there's some sort of justification there nonetheless. There's some value at stake. So in a sense, I think that desires fall under the sort of reason side of this divide. But we do have to be quite careful with that, for the simple reason that often we form our beliefs in quite irrational ways. So we shouldn't think the divide between our reason and our other faculties is one between our beliefs and other faculties.
So one of the problems is our reason is often irrational.
Yeah, exactly right.
That makes things exponentially complicated, doesn't it?
I would take a different view from Alex in that I think that the emotions are, in some sense, important psychological sense, more fundamental than reason. And so reason is something which works from an emotional base. So in that I'm more influenced by somebody like Hume than by Kant.
Sorry, to those who don't know, Hume said that without your passion, as he would have put it, meaning your emotions, you wouldn't be motivated to do anything, even whatever your reasons were.
Yes, that's right. I don't think it just applies to motivation, though. Constantine said earlier, even worse, it could affect our judgments. I think it actually starts there, that we make the moral judgments that we make through having the emotions that we do. And so, for me, I think the way in which we find out about what is truly of value, of course it involves a lot of thinking, in that sense reasoning, but it also involves a transformation of the emotions that we have. So it involves reflecting on our emotions. And you get this in traditions of virtue ethics. So Christianity thinks that you need to become a certain kind of loving person, and when you are, then you can really see what is of value. And Buddhism has some similar ideas about how we need to purify our emotional responses to the world.
In other words, we train our emotions to so that we become the sort of people that we want to be in terms of our behaviour. Is that what you're basically saying?
Yes, and I think that actually affects our knowledge of what is right and wrong, and not just our motivation to do what is right.
Okay, one idea that I've read in this area is that our emotions are a product of our innate sort of moral abilities or responses, rather than our emotions causing our moral responses. What do you think about that?
Well, clearly we have some innate moral opinions. So most people find...
Clearly?
Oh, incest, for instance, most people find morally repulsive.
Right.
And I don't think that's a learned thing. I think that's quite clearly an innate thing that we're born with for fairly obvious evolutionary reasons.
Okay.
At the same time, it seems pretty clear to me that emotional responses like that we can undermine by reasoning about the question. I mean, I have to ask whether this is right or wrong, but in principle we could undermine this emotional feeling by reasoning about the question and deciding just how we ought to feel about it.
Okay.
I would agree that there are some innate... I mean, human beings being what they are, we have a very large number of innate dispositions as a result of evolution, in large part. So it looks like what? Well, I think we're set up to feel certain types of emotion. Okay, so there seem to be, in one way in which psychologists
like
test this,
fear,
sadness, disgust, happiness,
right,
are some. I mean, the list changes. There's and the way that psychologists do this is they look at what's universal, and they think if something's universal, that's a good argument. Like all human beings have it, all cultures have it. It's a good argument for thinking that it's innate. Whereas if cultures differ, then that's a good argument for thinking that it's a product of that culture. There's something specific about it. So back in the 1970s, a psychologist called Paul Ekman tried to understand which emotions were universal, and in the 70s he came up with a list of 6, which included those 4 and a couple of others. But now his list is something like 19 different emotions. So I mean, with all empirical investigation, the more you do, the answers change.
Yeah.
But then there's a question as to how that gets taken up. So, for instance, fear can become guilt, or it can become shame, or something like that. Or disgust can become shame. Now, how does that change? So it might not be that...
I would just say, surely it's the case that... not all emotional reactions are, or even the basic emotional reactions are the same across all cultures. I mean, maybe there's some cultures that find incest less abhorrent than we do, or...
Apparently not.
Really?
I mean, that is really a factual question.
Well, let's take another thing, like maybe whether polygamy is okay or not okay, for instance. Or the age of allowed sexuality, for instance. That would vary across cultures.
And I think, I mean... Say Michael's right that this is a fact. There's still an interesting question whether it has to be a fact. So,
what's the fact that there is a moral thing that's universal?
That we all share a certain sort of attitude towards incest, for example, or anything else. You might, sitting on our armchairs, we might think, well, maybe that happens to be true, but we can easily imagine a society that didn't have this view. So even if it turns out to be an empirical fact, there might be something we might ask, why is that so? And does it matter?
Well, why is it so, and does it matter?
Well, what you really want to know is it a fact out of necessity? Is it biological necessity? So maybe there are Martians who wouldn't have this. So,
well, I guess if we're taking the standard view, it's like we've evolved to have these responses. But why? I guess would be the next question. Why are these particular types of responses necessary?
That's right. So then you get a kind of division between what Hume called an is and an ought. So you might think, well, we happen to be like that.
We happen to think that certain things are right and wrong.
That's right. Does that mean that we're right to think this? And you might think no, and that seems the more intuitive thought, that just because we happen to be like that or to be wired to have these thoughts, it doesn't mean that they're true. Or you might somehow try and derive the ought from the is. You might think that the norms of morality are somehow linked to norms of nature.
But this is an important question, I think, in morality, isn't it? It's if our moral responses are really that contingent, then there are no moral facts about things. They're just the way we feel about things, and that makes all our moral responses relative, doesn't it?
Well, you might think that some of our responses are innate and others aren't. And you might think even if the ones which are innate, we can, as it were, overturn them by thinking about the questions in quite a hard sort of way. I mean, that's the end of the story, really. All you need to know is that we're capable of reasoning about these questions, and sometimes that will support the innate judgments we make, and sometimes it will undermine them.
But isn't it an important question in philosophy whether there are moral facts about the world? Otherwise it just becomes a question of whatever you want to do is right.
It is absolutely a very central question. It's a question in metaethics more than a question in moral psychology.
Sorry, metaethics being the theories about theories of ethics.
Well, yes and no. I mean, that is its Latin meaning, that's true. Metaethics asks precisely that question. Is morality objective? Are there moral facts?
Right.
Or is what is right or wrong simply dependent upon us? So that's one question. And then if there are moral facts, how do we discover them would be another question in metaethics. So yes, that's a very important and big question in ethics. But I think there are quite a few options here apart from the answers yes and no. For instance, if they do depend on us, in which way? Is it subjective, so that morality is no more than each individual person spouting an opinion for which there is no contradiction? Well, that's not how morality morality seems. I mean, take the case of murder. We don't think that murder is wrong is something which is subjective. We actually, have the death penalty in certain places in the world, and in other places we lock people up. You can't do that with people for not liking turnips. Now, that certainly seems to be much more subjective. So there's a difference between liking turnips and liking to murder people.
Okay.
So it seems there's a difference there which is not just subjective.
Demurring from...
I think that last claim's hard to disagree with.
Yeah. But still, I mean, it still seems to boil down to this is wrong because we think it's wrong, not because it actually is wrong.
I mean, there's a general question in philosophy about how we can know that our own opinions are true. We can't sort of step outside our own skins and compare our beliefs with the facts. So we always have to look at things from our own perspective. At the same time, we might, from our perspective, try and live up to the truth. We try and gather evidence and reason about things to try to make sure that our views are sensible and coherent and fit with whatever evidence it is that we do have.
Okay. Now, I guess I want to ask a bit more of a practical question. I think one of you mentioned that you had the idea that we're only motivated to do what we want to do. Was that you, Alex?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So how... If what we want to do is purely selfish, I mean, there is a view of egoism that says that we're all just motivated to do what what is in our own self-interest.
Sure.
If that's true, then how can we ever have formed a moral society, and how can people be altruistic, for instance?
Right, so as you say, egoism is the view that when people act, they're always motivated to act in their own interests.
Right.
And one key reason for holding that view is that you sort of put two thoughts together. So one thought is that we're only ever motivated to act by our desires, and the other thought is doing what you want is always selfish. If you put those two thoughts together, it seems you get the egoistic view. You get the view people always act in their own interests. So it seems to me that one of those thoughts that leads to the theory is right, the view that we always act in whatever way most satisfies our desires, or something near enough. But it seems to me the other part of that view is wrong. It seems to me it's just plain false to think that acting on your desires is being selfish. So I might want to help someone in the street. There I'm acting on my desire, if I indeed act. But it's pretty clear that what I'm doing isn't selfish. I'm trying to help them after all.
Yeah, but why is that in your self-interest then? I guess the question is, why at all are you motivated to help other people at all?
Well, so as I said earlier, I think that in desiring things, we're responding to the value we see in them. So what's going on there is you think there's something worthwhile about helping this person, and that's the reason why you have this desire to help them.
Okay.
So the idea is that desires needn't be self-interested themselves, so you can have desires about things external to us,
right.
as well as desires about the self.
Sorry, I guess what I'm interested in, how did that desire arise in the first place?
Why, can I put a question back to you? Why is it more puzzling to think that people could be motivated to help each other than to think that people are selfish? Why couldn't I say, how do we explain why people are selfish?
Well, I don't know. I guess if you look at the behaviour of young children, they seem innately selfish. So it seems like the natural state is selfishness, and you have to sort of be trained out of that.
That again is something which I don't think is true. So Gregory Batson's been doing work on this, on empathy and whether it's innate, and he has shown pretty conclusively over the last 40 years that actually children are just as innately altruistic, sympathetic to the pains of others, as they are selfish. So it may be that, of course, they're more selfish than they are sympathetic or empathetic, and in moral education, in developing their characters, we want to encourage them to become more altruistic. But it looks like it's just as much an innate part of us. And just this last week, in fact, scientists found that this goes as far as rats. Dolphins have been known to do it, bats have been known to do it. This last week we've discovered that rats do it too. So it looks like altruism is built into at least mammals it has been for a very long time.
Okay. Anybody want to add anything, or want to move on?
I thought Michael was going to break into song there. Even rats do it.
Yeah, okay.
Let's be altruistic.
One famous problem, I think, from Aristotle concerns the weakness of the will, which is acrasio, I think, in Greek. How is it possible for you to do what you don't believe you should do. I mean, suppose you believe that you should lose weight and there's a cake in front of you. You have the cake, but you believe it's against your interests. How is that possible on this sort of view?
So Aristotle's answer, or at least one account of Aristotle's answer, is that the belief or even maybe knowledge that you shouldn't do this is somehow momentarily impaired or clouded. So think of the case where you have the ability to ride a bicycle, but then you have a few pints and you're not capable of riding the bicycle, but you don't lose the ability altogether. There's a sense in which you still know how to do it, but for this moment in time, you can't.
So you've got your reason is veiled.
So it's veiled in a way. So you might think, yes, I still have this knowledge, but I've somehow lost the access to it in this moment, maybe under the force of the cake or whatever that's.
But I would say that's
me.
a direct. That's a direct example of where your reason is being overridden by your emotions or your desires. I mean, isn't it?
Well, it's a case of knowledge or ability to act upon your reason being impaired or veiled, as you put it. But it might still be there in the sense that later on you might regain it and wonder, how on earth did I do that? Why on earth did I do that?
I don't think it's temporary. I mean, the question of how weakness of the will is possible only makes sense if you think that people are rational. Right. Like, generally, we're rational. We do what we think we have most reason to do most of the time.
Right.
If you don't think that, if you think people are actually just as irrational as they are rational, that people aren't, generally trying to do what they think they have most reason to do, or you have a sort of inherently conflicted model, then weakness of the will is not something which needs as much explanation. So you can think, well, you may as well ask, well, how is it that sometimes we do what we think we have most reason to do? Why do sometimes we act in a way which we think we should act? That's amazing. And you were asking that just a moment ago. How is it that we're altruistic rather than selfish? Sometimes, exactly. So it depends which way you approach human nature as to whether you think weakness of the will is something which needs explanation, or whether strength of the will actually needs explanation.
I mean, you might think that both of these things need explanation, right? You might think that in both cases you need to explain what sorts of things affect how you're motivated. So whether it's desires are important and sometimes they go in line with your judgments about what's best and sometimes they point the other direction, or whether the problem is that you sometimes fail to execute your intentions, or, well, there's all sorts of possibilities here. So I don't think we should... So in both cases, I think you're right, there's a need for an explanation, but that shouldn't make us think you don't need an explanation in either case. There's twice as much work to do, given what you said, which is fine. That keeps us in the job.
Okay, great. I think we're going to go to the next song now, and I've got Sian, Hender and Adam Leach, and they're going to be performing Dreaming.
That's right, Graham, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3.
stay in line. I'm dreaming. I'm
That was Dreaming. You're listening to the Philosophy Now radio show. I'm Grant Bartley from Philosophy Now magazine. I have with me Michael Lacewing, Alex Gregory and Constantine Sandis, and we're talking about moral psychology. Just getting back into this, what are the limits to how morality can be studied psychologically compared to philosophically? I mean...
So we've heard some questions that I think were more philosophical,
right,
and some that had more to do with empirical studies when we were talking about facts. And I think one thing we haven't said explicitly that at least I think philosophers do well is to examine our notions or concepts of things rather than the things themselves, maybe. And this can be very important. For example, it may turn out that different philosophers and psychologists are working with different notions of desire or motivation. It might be that some work with the idea that to desire just is to be motivated, in which case it would be no surprise that these things came together. And I think it's important to ask when we think about these things, to ask, for example, if you think an action was desired, do you mean it was desired in the sense in which it was voluntary, or the sense in which it was intentional, or some third thing?
Okay.
And that sometimes we need to get clear on these things in order to make progress.
So they work in tandem, or like DNA entwined together, really, to complement each other.
Interdisciplinary progress, there's a lot of space for that.
I mean, there is a sort of ideal of science that in science what you have to do is value-free in some way. You're dealing not at all with values. And obviously philosophers, especially those working at least near to ethics, are interested in questions of value.
Yeah.
So I think
what is good and what is bad and things like that.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So to that extent, I think there is a distinction to be made between the sorts of work, the sorts of questions we're interested in, and the sorts of questions scientists are interested in. And just to disagree a little bit with what Constantine just said, I take it that when we're inquiring to what's good and how we ought to live our lives, that's not merely a question about our concepts, but also a question about, well, reality in some sense. We're not just examining the way we think, we're examining what we ought to do.
Yes, I mean, I didn't want to suggest it was merely about concepts, but it was more that we might need to do that conceptual work in order to make sure that we both really are asking the same question or answering it.
Absolutely.
I mean, an example of that came up earlier was whether reason and emotion is a contrast.
Right.
Or whether in our understanding of emotion there's actually a place for what we can understand as reason. And that's not something which actually is settled psychologically or purely psychologically. For instance, suppose we establish that normal reasoning processes or emotion-free reasoning processes use different neural circuits from emotional processing systems. Okay, does that mean, just like that emotions are not rational? No, it doesn't, because it might be that there are two kinds of reasoning process, emotional and non-emotional, and that's something which involves philosophy as well as psychology.
It just gets more and more complicated the more bits you add in. Okay. How can...
You make it sound like a bad thing.
No, I just think there's no... knowledge is like a fractal, isn't it? The deeper you go into it, the more things open up. How can moral psychology help us to choose between competing ethical theories and
well, there's a lot of work which has been going on with philosophers interested in some of the empirical studies on this. And I mean, just to pick two examples. One is a philosopher at Harvard called Joshua Green, who's been working on moral intuitions, our intuitions in practical cases, whether we should do this or do that. And here's the example he's been looking at is you have a trolley or a train coming down a track which has a siding, and on the track in front of the train there are 5 people, and on the siding there is 1 person, and nobody can get out of the way of the train can't brake. Should you change the track, change the setting of the track, the points, so that the train goes down the siding and kills 1 person rather than 5? And people have interestingly different intuitions, and you vary the case, you get different intuitions. And he thinks that he has shown that some of these intuitions are irrational because they involve certain emotional responses, and others of them are rational. So he thinks he can draw a philosophical conclusion actually in favour of the view that you should do the least harm or the most good to people, rather than that you shouldn't deliberately intervene in ways which would offend anybody, for instance. So some people say, no, you can't change it because that means you would kill the 1 person. Other people say you have to change it because otherwise the train would kill 5 people. So that's one example. Another is that some people have been arguing, following some stuff in psychology, that there's no such thing as character.
Right.
Now that comes as a bit of a surprise. But if there is no such thing as character, then a theory like Aristotle's, which says that morality is all about becoming a good person, having a good character, can't work.
What does it mean there's no such thing as character? That doesn't make any sense to me. I mean, surely we've got standard ways we behave in certain situations.
Well, that's what you'd think. And this is one of the shocking things of the last 40 years. There's a movement in social psychology called situationism, which has gathered a huge amount of evidence to show that for most people, in fact, what influences what they do in any situation are particular things in the situation. So, for instance, suppose here's an actual example they set up. Suppose you see somebody drop their letters, in a public place. Do you stop and help them? And you might think that what we'll get is that people who are nice, have that disposition to be nice and helpful generally, will be the people who stop, and people who aren't nice won't. It turns out that much more influential than that is whether the people have just found a 10p piece lying about in the place. And if they found a 10p piece, it's much more likely that they'll stop and help the other person. If they haven't, it isn't.
Okay.
And you can do this again and again and again. So it looks like we behave by reacting to situations and not because we have any standing dispositions, as you say, to behave in particular ways in particular situations.
Okay.
That's only half the evidence, then.
All right. Constantine, you were nodding, which doesn't really work so well on the radio.
No, actually, I think it was an inner nod. I'm sceptical about the conclusions of these experiments and how they're reached.
Why are you sceptical?
So, for example, one thing you might ask, the way Michael just framed the question is, so does that mean they already know in advance who's nice and who isn't, and then they decide, oh look, that didn't have any effect? Well, if that's true, then presumably there is such a thing as niceness, it just doesn't have an effect, and therefore there is such a thing as character. If, on the other hand, they can't decide in advance who's nice and who's not, not, then it's not clear how they can be sure that it is the situation that's doing this, other than some kind of statistical thing, which is compatible with, the majority of people having an average kind of character.
Okay, so you're saying at this late point in the show that there may be some problems with the way that these moral psychologists phrase their experiments, for instance.
Yes, and their inferences. So it may be that their data is extremely interesting, but the inferences they draw from it are, I'd say, too strong.
So there's still a lot of work to be done in this area.
Which is a good thing.
Yeah.
Okay. So maybe I'll ask you to finish there, Alex. So what future developments, or maybe anybody can add, but what future developments do you foresee or are you working on? What sort of things? What are you working on that you're trying to find out?
Well, I'm still working on, as I said, desires and trying to work out what they are. Seems like there's some interesting work.
What's the aim of what you're trying to do? What are you trying to prove or discover?
So I suppose I'm partly trying to come to a conclusion about this very, very popular view that the way you ought to act is determined entirely by what it is that you want, determined by your desires. The truth of that view is, as you might imagine, hotly contested and has been for a very long time. I think it would certainly be a good thing if we could resolve whether that theory is true or not. Whether we will, I guess we don't know yet. That's the point of doing the research.
What's your feeling right now?
I don't think I have time to...
Yeah, okay.
The answer's complicated.
That's fair enough. Okay, I don't really think we've got a lot of time. Does anybody got any last thoughts they want to add on the top? Anything that you think anybody out there listening really needs to know about moral psychology to end with?
One thought, very briefly, we haven't mentioned anything about the unconscious, or very little about the unconscious. There's a lot of work going on now, not in the sort of psychoanalytic sense, but in the notion that a lot of the way in which we react, a lot of the way in which we think and are motivated is outside our consciousness. And there's a lot of work going on in psychology at the moment about how the conscious and the unconscious systems that influence our actions interact. And I think we're going to see a lot of work on that going forward.
Sure. Constantine, what?
That's right, and that relates to contemporary work on reasons as well, and I think future work. So think of the examples Michael was giving before with a train track and whether you what you do in a given situation and people's intuitions. One thing the experiments might show is that the reasons we give might not be the same as our
real
motives.
Reasons.
Well, what some people are tempted to call our real reasons. So we might give these kind of complicated reasons for why we prefer we do one thing in one scenario and would do another in another, but arguably hidden motives and other factors for our intuitions can be uncovered.
Okay, thank you. And Alex, any last thoughts on moral psychology you want the listeners to take away with them?
I can't think of anything that springs to mind.
Okay, well, we'll just go straight into... Well, before we go into the song, let me say that you've got a website that people can go to, Adam, if they want to. What's that?
They can come and say hello at adampaulleach.com.
Okay, anybody got any projects they want to plug quickly on the air? Okay, I've got... My books are Love, Solitude and Destruction, which is a book of short stories, and The Meta-Revolution, which is a philosophy meta-manifesto. You can get them online. And we're going to just... next week we're doing the philosophy of human rights, and you've been listening to the Philosophy Now radio show, and we're going to end with Adam and Paul doing a song called Fallen.
Right. 1, 2. I've got a bird to whistle, and I've got a bird to sing, and this girl I'm loving, oh, she doesn't need a thing, 'cause I am falling, yes, I'm falling, I am falling for you. Lord, can you save me? Can you save me from myself? The devil's gone and turned me inside out. I'm coming home, but I don't know when. And if you're there, we can start again. inside.